I'll build you a cabin and fill it with children." The giant cowboy promised as she hid from her kin. The town clung to the side of the gulch like grit under a fingernail, a crooked run of boardwalks and false fronts pressed up against hills of red rock and thin pines. It was late summer in the high country, the kind that burned the air dry by noon and laid a pale dust across everything by dusk. Men coughed from old mine air, mules flicked at flies, and the wind dragged the smell of pine pitch, iron, and stale whiskey down the single street. Beneath a sign that squealed in the breeze-wash basins, "Tobacco, flour." She stood with a burlap sack of potatoes hugged tight to her chest and tried to be the kind of woman no one looked at twice. The name she used here was Miss Claire Boone. The name her family used for her, when they bothered to use any name at all, was Clara Whitcomb. She kept her hat brim low, kept her hair in a simple coil, kept her eyes on her own boots. Her kin had long money and a mean memory. If a cousin rode through and recognized her, this narrow town would turn from haven to snare in a blink. Clara rented a back room above the laundry, where steam and lye fought the mountain chill and made the boards sweat even in the night. The room had one crooked window and a view of the livery roof where pigeons strutted like small bosses. She liked the sound of the big copper pots below, the thump of paddles, the clean slap of wet cloth honest work that drowned the talk. Talk was bad for a woman who needed to vanish. She kept her things small and neat. A tin of needles, one extra dress, a folded quilt, a man's knife she had taken when she ran, and a little wooden figure tucked in a wool sock. The figure was a child's toy carved rough from juniper round head, stub arms, no more detail than a button nose. Years ago, on a night when she thought fear would crack her open, she had smoothed that little wooden face with her thumb until the oil from her skin made it shine. The toy had weight beyond wood. It reminded her that softness could be carried in a hard life. She told no one about it. She told no one anything. The town called itself Silver Vein, though everyone knew. The real silver had run thin and left behind mostly hope and sour ground. The men still tried the tailings, still hit the timbers and pried at the earth as if the mountain might change its mind and give them something. The women ran boarding houses and stitched torn sleeves, kept chickens that threw pale eggs in the cool mornings. Church on Sundays, cards on Saturdays, whiskey all the time. Everyone watched everyone else because there were only so many faces to look at, and a new one made noise like a dropped pan. Clara had been here 2 months and had learned how to make herself the kind of plane that stays put. She helped at the laundry and sometimes the schoolhouse when the teacher's cough got bad. She knew the names of every dog and none of the deputies. She had cut the Whitcomb from her letters and burned the ash. She woke before dawn, when the sky was a strip of tarnished silver over the ridge, and took the long path out behind town with a bucket and a short-handled spade. The path broke apart into deer tracks and then into nothing, and the land opened to a shallow meadow rimmed by aspen. Their bark held the first light like paper lanterns. The grass was still wet with cold. She knelt and dug for wild onions, the thin bulbs like tears in the dirt, and she breathed easier out there, away from boots and voices. The onions were for the laundry woman's stew and for the widow 2 rooms down who had lost a baby last winter and barely had the strength to eat. Clara set the bucket by her skirt and leaned back on her heels to rest. Clouds were stacked low over the far ridge and creeping like cattle, slow but sure. A crow flung itself from one aspen to the next, scolding everything it saw. The quiet made her heart settle into a steady pace, not the jitter of flight. She thought about what a home might sound like if it was hers alone. Nails going straight, boards fitting without argument, the soft bump of a chair against a table, the tick of a tin clock. She thought about doors that shut out the Whitcomb name like a wind shut out by chinked logs. When she rose to go, she felt it again, that prickle along the neck that said a gaze was hooked between her shoulders. She listened with her body, the way a woman learns to if she wants to live long. Nothing moved in the grass but beetles. Nothing stirred in the aspens but the wind. Still, she took the long way back, slipping through willow and stone, washing her boots in the creek to lose any easy track. Back in town, the day had opened its mouth wide hammers, buckets, a mule's balking bray. She passed the sign for the post office and saw, without turning her head, a new paper tacked on the wall. She did not look. Papers were always a risk. Names like to crawl out of ink and bite. At noon, the sun was harsh white in the gulch, and the boardwalks threw black slashes of shade. She set the onions on the back step of the laundry and went to the pump for water. 2 boys were trying to work the handle, too short to get the rhythm. Clara slid in and took the iron in her hands, set a pace so the pump did not fight itself. Water came with a cough and then a rush, cold as spring, and the boys whooped at the glitter of it. She smiled the small smile she gave strangers, enough to be human, not enough to invite. Nearby, the blacksmith let the bellows fall quiet and wiped his face with his sleeve. "Hotter 'n a skillet," he said to no one in particular. "Storm by evening," answered the liveryman. They were the kind of men who noticed sky and air and what animals were thinking. She trusted that kind. In the afternoon, she hemmed 2 shirts and a dress with a red ribbon that made her think of blood and berries and a life much louder than this one. She drank coffee burned dark by the pot and ate a slice of bread and called it enough. Around 4, the freight wagon creaked up from the south. Canvas bowed with supplies, 6 mules and a driver with a bright green scarf. Men who had been lazy with heat straightened like dogs catching scent. The driver pulled up before the general store and began to toss down crates, flour, lamp oil, nails. Normal things that keep a town upright. Then the street went quiet, the way a shift in wind makes a whole stand of grass tilt one way at once. She did not mean to look. She looked anyway. He had to swing his legs sideways to drop from the wagon seat without cracking his head on the frame. Boots hit dirt. Dust leapt up and settled like it was afraid to land on him. He was broad, the way trees are broad, made for weather. A rolled canvas bed and a coil of rope lay behind him. Nothing else but a hat pulled low. He stood, and the air near him seemed to make more room. The driver said something easy, like men do when they like a man and want him to know it without fuss. The big man's reply was short and quiet enough that she could not catch words, only the sense of a voice built for distance. She looked away at once, heat in her face that had nothing to do with the day. He was not for her story. He was for someone else's trouble. That was what she told herself as she bent over the hem again and set her needle moving. But when the needle slipped and bit her fingertip and a bright bead rose, she realized her hand was shaking, and the old piece of juniper in her pocket felt heavier than wood. The storm over the ridge had grown darker. The street had changed, and for the first time in months she felt the shape of her life tilt, the way a wagon leans when it finds ruts deeper than expected. The rain came hard and sudden that night, drumming on the tin roof above the laundry until the walls shivered. Wind curled under the eaves and pushed at the shutters. Clara sat up in her narrow bed, the quilt pulled around her shoulders, listening for the one sound she feared most, boots on the back stair. The rain covered a lot of things, but not that. She told herself she was being foolish. Her kin were far from here. No one in Silver Vein had reason to trouble her, yet she kept her boots near and her coat folded at the foot of the bed, just in case she had to run. By morning the rain was gone, leaving the air raw and the dirt streets scored with wagon ruts that shone like dull pewter. The laundry yard steamed from the heat of the first wash. Clara wrung out sheets until her arms ached, the cold water biting her skin, and tried not to think about the man she'd seen yesterday. But the image wouldn't leave, how he'd stepped down from the freight wagon with the unhurried balance of someone who belonged anywhere he stood. How the street had gone still, not with fear exactly, but with the weight of noticing. By midday she learned more. Word passed quick in a town this size. His name, the way it was passed from mouth to mouth, sounded more like a warning than an introduction. Eli Cutter. Folks said he was too big to ride a horse without making it look small, too quiet for anyone to trust and too handy with his fists for comfort. Someone muttered he'd worked in the lumber camps up north until a man died in a fight there. Someone else swore he'd done time in Yuma. Every telling left out more than it put in, which to Clara's mind made the truth both simpler and worse. She didn't expect to cross paths with him. Men like that didn't linger where women like her kept their heads down. But Silver Vein was small, and by late afternoon the line between their lives blurred. She was at the pump behind the general store filling 2 buckets for the laundry, when a shadow slid across the ground beside her. She looked up, and there he was, broad hat, coat dark with old stains, eyes a steady grey under the brim. He carried a sack of feed in one hand, easy as if it weighed nothing. For a heartbeat she considered nodding, the polite half-smile then moving on, but he stopped, set the sack down and took the pump handle from her grip as if it belonged to him. "Let me," he said. The voice was deep, not loud, and it carried the way thunder does when it's still far off but coming your way. She stepped back without thinking. The handle rose and fell under his arm like it weighed less than kindling. Water gushed, clean and cold, filling both buckets in half the time it took her alone. "Thank you," she said, careful to keep her tone even. She reached for the buckets, but he kept one hand on the handle and the other on the wood bale. "Where do these go?" She hesitated. It was one thing to take his help at the pump, another to let him follow her behind the laundry. "Just across the street." He nodded once, took both buckets as if they were empty, and started walking. She had to hurry to keep up. People turned to look. A woman in his shadow was like a lantern in the dark, you noticed. At the laundry door, he set the buckets down without a word and stepped back. She waited for him to speak, to ask for something, to offer something she didn't want. Instead, he tipped his hat in a small, almost formal gesture, picked up his sack of feed, and walked away. That night, she found it hard to rest. She'd been noticed. Not by her kin, no. This was different. This was the kind of noticing that shifted things without asking permission. She'd built a life here out of smallness, out of not being remembered. Eli Cutter, with his size and silence, had marked her in the minds of anyone who saw them together. Gossip had long legs in Silver Vein. The next 2 days she kept to herself. She worked, she mended, she stayed in the laundry until the sky went dark. But on the third morning, when she stepped out to fetch kindling, he was leaning against the post outside the livery, watching the street like a man who had all the time in the world. He saw her, straightened, crossed the street in a few long strides. "I need a hand," he said. "No," preamble. "Got a place up on the North Ridge. Roof's bad. Could use someone who knows a needle." She frowned. "I mend clothes, not roofs." His mouth twitched. Maybe the beginning of a smile, maybe not. "Canvas patch'll hold till I can get new boards. Pays fair, or I can trade in kind." In kind? She didn't like the sound of that. "Wood, eggs, whatever you need." She should have said no. Every sensible part of her said no. But there was something in the way he stood open, unhurried, that told her he wasn't asking to trap her. Still, she didn't give him an answer then. "I'll think on it," she said. He tipped his hat again and left it there. No pressure, no leaning closer. Just that one line, given plain, like he trusted her to decide for herself. By evening, the sky was thick with the kind of clouds that meant weather was moving in from the west. She sat at her little window with the wooden figure in her hand, thumb over the smooth curve of its head. She thought about the roof on a Northridge cabin, wind howling over it in winter, snow stacking deep. She thought about the way his hands had moved at the pump, steady and sure, and how he'd carried her buckets without strain. She thought about how easy it would be for someone to follow her there if they wanted to, how dangerous it could be to go anywhere alone with a man the town already called dangerous. And yet, under all that, there was a pull, quiet but insistent, toward the idea of stepping outside the narrow life she'd made here. When she finally lay down, the quilt tight to her chin, her mind wouldn't still. The sound of boots on the stair would still make her rise in a breath. But for the first time since she'd come to Silver Vein, she realized there was another sound she might listen for. A knock, not in warning, but in asking. And she didn't know yet which would be more dangerous. The morning after, she'd half promised to think on it. Clara woke to a sky the color of dull tin. The air smelled like wet pine and cold stone. The sort of scent that always came before a storm pressed its weight down on the mountains. She pulled on her boots and coat, telling herself she was only stepping out to check the pump, maybe fetch a loaf from the bakery before the day's work began. But her feet didn't take her toward the bakery. They took her toward the north end of town where the trail up the ridge began. The boardwalk thinned into dirt and the sound of her boots softened under the dust. Above, the ridge rose in slow, rolling shoulders patched with spruce and yellowing aspen. She had no plan to go far, just enough to look toward the place he'd spoken of, to see if it was even real. A cabin in the pines could be nothing more than a man's talk. Then, as she rounded the bend where the street ended, she saw him. Eli Cutter stood beside a mule, looping a rope through the high sideboards of a wagon. The wagon bed held a coil of rope, a hammer, a bundle of canvas, and a neat stack of boards. each cut to length, ends squared clean. Not the kind of thing a drifter hauled unless he meant to build. "You came," he said, voice low but steady, as if her arrival were not a question but a simple fact. "I said I'd think on it," she answered, wishing her tone didn't sound like she was making excuses. "And?" She hesitated. There was a sharp, sensible no balanced on the edge of her tongue. But then she glanced at the boards in his wagon, the mule's patient flank, the coil of rope, and thought about how small her rented room felt on nights when the wind pressed in against the walls. "I can patch canvas," she said finally, "but I'm not climbing any roof." He nodded once. Fair enough. He offered a hand to help her up onto the wagon seat. She ignored it, set her foot on the wheel hub and swung herself up. His mouth twitched, the barest glimmer of respect, before he turned to take the mule's lead. The trail out of town bent quickly into the shadow of the ridge, and the sound of the street fell away behind them. The climb was slow, the wagon wheels bumping over roots and stones. Eli walked beside the mule, one broad hand steady on the bridle, his hat pulled low against the morning glare. Clara kept her eyes on the path ahead, but every so often she found herself noticing small things about him. The even length of his stride, the way his shoulders stayed loose, the quiet patience in how he handled the animal. An hour in, the trees thickened. Spruce gave off their sharp, resinous scent, and the air grew cooler. The trail opened into a narrow clearing, and there it was, the cabin. It wasn't much yet. The log walls stood solid, though the chinking was worn thin in places. The roof was a patchwork of old boards, newer ones, and a strip of tarp flapping like a stubborn flag in the wind. Beside the cabin was a low shed, half leaning, and a chopping block sunk into the ground like it had been there a decade. A small stack of split wood stood ready, ends silver from weather. Eli unhitched the mule and set it to graze, then hauled the boards off the wagon and leaned them against the wall. "You'll be inside," he said, "canvas patch over the kitchen rafters. It leaks bad there when the rain comes." Inside was cooler still, shadows smelling faintly of old smoke and pine dust. The kitchen rafters rose low enough that she could reach them from a table. She set to work without much talk, spreading the canvas, cutting it square, sewing a hem to take the nails. Eli moved outside and she could hear the steady rhythm of hammer on wood as he worked on the roof line. They broke at midday. He set a small pot of beans on the stove and cut thick slices from a round of bread. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of tin forks and the soft ticking of the stove. "You built this yourself?" she asked at last, nodding toward the log walls. "Bit by bit," he said. "Logs came down the ridge. I hauled them here. Took me near all of last summer." She looked around at the bare shelves, the single chair by the stove, the narrow bunk against the far wall. "Not much in it?" His eyes met hers across the table, steady and without any hint of shame. "A place starts with walls and a roof. Rest comes after." Something in the way he said it settled under her ribs. It was not a boast, not a plea, just a fact, like he could see the shape of what might be here long before it existed. When the canvas was nailed tight over the rafters, she stepped back to see if it would hold. The stitches were straight, the hem snug. Eli came in from outside, looked up and gave a single nod. Approval from him felt like the kind of thing you could store away against a lean season. "You said you wanted to trade in kind," she reminded him. He walked to the shed, came back with a neat bundle of split wood and a basket with 6 brown eggs cushioned in straw. "That'll do for now," he said. Then, after a pause, "You come back when you've a mind to." "There's more work here, not just for pay." She frowned. "What does that mean?" "Means," he said, slow as if choosing each word, "a place this size takes more than one person to make it a home." The words were plain, but they landed in her chest like something heavier. She turned toward the door before she could answer, stepping out into the high ridge air, which smelled of pine and distant rain. The mule stood waiting, the wagon ready. The trail back to town felt shorter somehow, though neither of them spoke. She climbed down before he could offer his hand, took the bundle of wood and the eggs, and turned toward the laundry without looking back. But that night, with the quilt drawn up to her chin, she thought about those words, more than one person to make it a home, and about the bare cabin waiting in the trees. She tried to tell herself it was only a trade, nothing more, yet somewhere, under all her careful caution, something in her had already stepped across that threshold and stayed. 3 days passed before Clara saw Eli cut her again, though she told herself she wasn't watching for him. The wood he'd given her burned slow in the laundry stove, the eggs were boiled and eaten, and the ridge cabin stayed in her mind like the aftertaste of strong coffee present, even when she was busy with other things. She kept her head down, hemmed shirts, scrubbed sheets, and took the long route to the pump to avoid walking past the livery where he sometimes stood. On the 4th morning, she stepped out with a basket of mending for the schoolteacher and saw him waiting at the far end of the boardwalk. His hat brim shadowed his eyes, but she knew it was him from the stillness in his stance. Men who loitered in town usually shifted their weight, fidgeted with their hands, looked for a game of cards or someone to jaw at. Eli stood as if the boards under his boots had been built for him alone. When she reached him, he nodded toward the trail out of town. "Need to haul some beams up to the cabin," he said. "Could use another pair of hands. Steadying the load." "I'm not carrying beams up that ridge," she answered, half smiling despite herself. "Don't have to. Just ride along and keep the mule from spooking on the switchbacks." She hesitated. It was a simple thing, but she knew how simple things grew into stories in a town like this. "If folks see me, they'll think you're helping with work," he said, and his tone made it sound like that was the end of it. "Unless you'd rather let the mule walk herself dizzy and spill half the load into the gully," she sighed, shifting the basket to her other arm. "How long? Half a day?" That was how she found herself on the wagon seat again, the basket of mending at her feet, the morning cool on her face as they started up the ridge. The beams rattled in the bed behind them, bound with rope and wrapped in burlap where the ends might scrape. Eli kept the mule at a steady pace, the reins loose in his hands, his gaze flicking to the trail ahead and back again like a man measuring every turn. "Where'd you get the beams?" she asked, more to fill the quiet than for any real need to know. "Salvage from a mill up the valley. Old but straight. Better than anything I can cut by hand." She nodded, thinking about how each part of that cabin had a history before it became part of his walls. "You build the shed the same way?" "Mostly. Couple boards came from a barn that burned last spring." His voice was flat, but she heard something underneath it. Memory. Maybe loss. The switchbacks narrowed, the wagon wheels groaning against the slope. Clara kept one hand on the mule's bridle when the trail tilted, talking low to keep the animal's ears forward. Eli glanced at her once, and she thought she saw approval there, though he didn't say it. By the time they reached the cabin clearing, her arms were tired from steadying the mule, and her skirts were dusted from the road. Eli unloaded the beams one by one, stacking them neat by the north wall. She set her basket inside on the small table, and was about to step back out when she noticed something new on the shelf above the stove next to the battered coffee pot sat a small wooden cradle. It was rough-hewn, unfinished, but the curve of the rails and the smooth sanding on the headboard showed care. She ran a hand over the wood. "This yours?" Eli stepped into the doorway, wiping dust from his palms. "Started it last winter." "For?" She left the word open, unsure if she wanted to hear the answer. "Someday," he said, simple as that. "A place ought to be ready even before it's full." Her throat tightened, though she couldn't say why. "Seems a lot to build for someday." "Someday comes fast if you let it." They worked through the morning, Eli setting the beams for what would be a proper porch, Clara mending the seat cushion that had split in the corner. Now and again she stepped outside to hold a plank steady or hand him nails from the small tin. By midday, the porch frame stood firm and the sun had burned the morning, chill from the air. When they stopped to eat bread, a wedge of cheese and coffee so strong it bit the tongue. Eli looked out over the ridge toward the valley. "This place could hold more," he said. "Not just walls and a roof. A garden maybe. Chickens." "You planning to keep chickens up here?" "Why not? Wolves don't bother much if you keep them penned close." She smiled faintly. "Sounds like you've thought it all through." "I have," he said, turning back to her. "A cabin's only half a home without voices in it, without a reason to keep the fire going." The words landed heavy between them, and she found herself looking away, pretending to watch the mule crop at the grass. She wanted to ask if he meant her in that picture, but the question stuck in her chest. By the time they headed back down the ridge, clouds had gathered over the far peaks, and the wind smelled of snow even though it was too early in the year. The trail felt narrower in the afternoon light, the drop to the valley sharper. At one point the mule balked at a loose rock slide, and Clara's hand shot to the bridle before she even thought. She talked low and steady until the animal eased forward again, Eli's gaze on her the whole time. When they rolled into Silver Vane, a few townsfolk turned to watch, their eyes following the wagon until it passed the last storefront. Clara felt their curiosity like heat against her back. She climbed down before Eli could offer help gathering her basket. "Thank you," he said, like she'd done more than keep a mule calm. "For what?" "For showing up." She didn't answer, just nodded and stepped onto the boardwalk. But as she walked away, she realized she wasn't just carrying her mending home, she was carrying the picture he'd planted in her head. A porch, a garden, chickens, and the sound of voices, warm against the quiet of the ridge. The first frost came early that year, settling on the laundry yard like a spill of white ash. Clara woke to see her breath fog the air in her little room, the boards of the floor cold enough to bite through her stockings. She pulled on her boots, lit the small lamp, and thought of the ridge. Up there, with the wind coming down unbroken, the cold would be sharper, the nights longer. She wondered if Eli Cutter had enough wood stacked for the winter. She hadn't planned to go. The sensible thing was to keep her head down, work through the season, and avoid giving the town more reason to notice her. But sometime after she'd scrubbed the morning's laundry and hung it to steam in the yard, her hands were carrying her mending kit to the pump, and her boots were turning toward the north trail. The climb to the ridge was steeper now, the air thinner. The mule's tracks were pressed into the damp earth from recent use, leading her toward the cabin. She found Eli outside, splitting wood in a slow, steady rhythm. Each swing of the axe was precise, no wasted movement, the block cracking clean under his hands. "You're early," he said, setting another log on the block. "Thought you might need more help before the snow comes." She kept her voice light, as if it were only a practical errand. He studied her for a moment, then nodded toward the shed. Could use an extra pair of hands stacking. She worked alongside him, stacking the split logs so the cut ends faced out, a neat wall of wood that would dry in the cold air. Now and then their hands brushed when passing a log, each time sending a flicker of warmth through her chilled fingers. When the pile was high enough to last a good stretch, they carried the smaller pieces inside to stack beside the stove. The air in the cabin was warmer than outside, and the scent of pine sap clung to the wood. Clara noticed changes since her last visit: a shelf fixed above the bunk, a second chair by the stove, a kettle polished clean. "You've been busy," she said, setting her bundle by the wall. "Cabin doesn't build itself." He poured water into the kettle, set it on the stove. "Tea?" She hesitated. Tea meant sitting, meant not pretending she was just passing through. "All right." They sat at the small table, steam curling from the tin mugs. Through the window the spruce swayed under the wind's push, their needles whispering in a language older than the town below. "I meant what I said," Eli said after a moment. "A place like this should be full." She looked up, caught in the direct weight of his gaze. "Full of what?" "Life," he said simply. "Laughter. Work worth doing. Children running between the trees." His voice softened on that last part, and for a heartbeat she imagined it. The porch finished, a garden staked out, small boots by the door. The thought warmed and unsettled her in equal measure. "You don't even know me," she said. "I know enough." He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. "I know you work hard. I know you can steady a mule on a narrow trail. I know you don't scare easy, even when folks try to make you." Her pulse quickened. She set her mug down carefully. "You've been asking about me." He didn't deny it. "Small town. People talk." "They talk about you too," she said, and saw his jaw tighten just enough to notice. "They'll keep talking. I can't change that. Only thing I can do is build something worth the talking." There was no plea in his tone, no soft edge, just the steady certainty that marked all his words. She stood, needing to move, and went to the shelf where the small wooden cradle still sat. Her fingers brushed the smooth curve of the headboard. "You really plan to finish this?" she asked. "When there's a reason to." She turned toward him, the cold air seeping in around the doorframe, lifting the hair at her neck. "And you think I'd be that reason?" His eyes didn't waver. "I think you could be." The kettle hissed on the stove, filling the silence between them. Clara looked away first, her hands tightening around her mending kit. She wanted to laugh at the boldness of it, but laughter would have been too close to letting the words take root. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the faint smell of snow. She told him she needed to get back before dark, that the laundry wouldn't run itself. He didn't try to stop her, only walked her to the wagon where the mule stood ready. "Next week," he said as she climbed up. "We'll start on the garden fence before the ground freezes." She didn't promise, just nodded and flicked the reins. The ridge trail stretched ahead, the trees leaning under the wind, the valley below already in shadow. By the time she reached the edge of town, the first flakes were falling slow, deliberate, like they knew the season had turned. People glanced up at the sky, then at her, the mule, the road she'd come from. She kept her chin down, but inside, Eli's words moved through her, like the start of a thaw beneath ice. That night, she sat in her narrow bed with the wooden figure in her palm. She thought of the cradle on the shelf, of his voice when he spoke of children, and of how easily he'd said, "I know enough." She told herself it was just talk, a man's habit of making promises to fill the air, but deep down she knew there was weight in those words, a weight she could feel every time the wind rattled the shutters, something that could anchor her or pull her under. Snow came early and heavy, burying the boardwalk edges in drifts that crusted over at night and squeaked underfoot in the morning. The air in Silver Vein turned brittle, each breath cutting sharp in the lungs. Clara worked with her sleeves rolled down, her hands in constant motion to keep the cold from setting in. Steam from the laundry curled out into the street, making the windows sweat. She tried to keep her head filled with simple things, washing, mending, keeping the stove fed, but thoughts of the ridge cabin slipped in like drafts under a door. She hadn't been back in nearly 2 weeks. She told herself that was because of the snow, the icy trail, the work piling up before Christmas. The truth was simpler. She didn't want to make it too easy for him. But when the weather eased for a day, the sky clearing to a pale blue, she found herself walking to the north end of town again. The wagon was gone from the livery, but tracks in the snow showed where it had headed out. The trail up to the ridge was narrow now, flanked by banks of snow that had been shoveled aside and frozen into small walls. The climb took longer than before, the mule plodding slow, the wagon bed carrying a bundle of blankets, some dry beans, and a tin of lard she'd bought as an excuse for coming. When the cabin came into view, she stopped. Smoke curled from the stovepipe, but the door was wide open, the wind shoving snow across the threshold. Eli stood in the yard, coat off despite the cold, sleeves rolled, holding a long-handled axe in both hands. His shoulders heaved with each swing, the blade biting deep into the post of a half-built fence. "What happened?" she called, stepping down from the wagon. He didn't stop swinging until the post split clean in two. "Found it half-pulled this morning," he said. "Someone tried to tear it down in the night." Her stomach dropped. "Who?" He shrugged, jaw tight. "Tracks were covered by dawn. Could be anyone." She knew better. "My kin?" The words came out flat, a fact more than a guess. "They found me." He planted the axe in the snow and straightened, his height and breadth making the open yard seem smaller. "If they had, they'd have come to your door. This was a warning. They're testing the ground." A wind gust threw snow into her face, but she didn't flinch. "What will you do?" "Finish the fence," he said simply, "and make sure the door stays shut." Inside, the cabin was warmer than she expected, the stove throwing a steady heat. The cradle was gone from the shelf. In its place sat a small stack of folded quilts. She set the beans and lard on the table, not asking about the change. While Eli worked outside, she moved through the cabin, noticing small preparations, extra wood stacked inside. Tools hung in easy reach, a shotgun leaning near the door. It wasn't paranoia, it was readiness. When he came in, stamping snow from his boots, he closed the door with a firm hand and latched it. "If someone's coming," he said, "you should stay here until the weather turns." She bristled. "I can't just disappear from town. That'll start talk." "It's already started," he said. "They'll be watching now, whether you go back or not. Here at least you've got walls between you and them." She wanted to argue, but the memory of the split fence post sat in her chest like a weight. "And if they come here?" His eyes didn't waver. "Then they'll have to go through me." For the rest of the day they worked side by side, mending the fence and shoveling the snow away from the cabin walls. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it was to point out the best place to stack brush for a windbreak, or where the ground stayed driest under the trees. She listened, memorizing the details as if they might matter later. At dusk, the wind came down off the ridge, carrying the sound of branches cracking under ice. They ate by lamplight beans cooked soft, bread warmed on the stove's top plate. Clara caught herself watching him across the table, the way his hands moved, precise and without hurry. She realized he wasn't just building a cabin, he was building a place meant to hold against more than weather. When the meal was done, he rose and fetched something from the shelf above the bunk. It was the cradle, now with a strip of quilted fabric lining the bottom. "Didn't get rid of it," he said, catching her look. "Just moved it while I worked on it." She touched the quilt lining. "You made this?" "Cut from an old one I had. Better than leaving it bare." Her fingers lingered on the stitches. "Why keep working on it now?" His voice was steady. "Because when trouble's close, that's when you make sure the future has a place to land." The words caught her off guard. She wanted to say they had no such future, that her kin's shadow was too long, but she couldn't make her mouth form it. Instead, she stood and set her mending kit on the table, pulling out a needle and thread. "If we're finishing it," she said, "we might as well make it strong." They worked in companionable silence, her stitching the lining tight while he planed the cradle's rails smooth. Outside, the wind howled and snow battered the roof, but inside, the lamplight fell warm over the table, over their hands, over the small space that felt for a moment like it belonged only to them. When the cradle was set back on the shelf, finished for now, Eli checked the latch on the door one last time. "You'll stay here tonight," he said. It wasn't a question. She didn't argue. Not because she couldn't, but because the thought of the empty room above the laundry suddenly felt colder than the snow outside. She lay on the bunk under the quilts while he kept the stove fed. The steady scrape of the poker and the low roar of the fire a comfort she hadn't expected. Long after the lamplight went out, she lay awake, listening to the wind and thinking of the split fence post, the cradle on the shelf, and the way he'd said they'll have to go through me. She wondered if that was protection, or the start of a fight she couldn't turn back from. Morning broke with a silence so deep it felt wrong. Clara woke to find the light in the cabin dim and blue, the air heavy with the scent of snow. She sat up, pulling the quilt around her shoulders, and saw Eli already at the stove, the coffee pot steaming, his coat on, hat pulled low. "Storm's over," he said without looking up. "Sky's clear. Cold's worse now, though. Everything's frozen solid." She slid her feet into her boots, the leather stiff from the night chill. "Fence still standing?" "Still standing," he answered, pouring coffee into a tin mug and handing it to her. "But something came near last night." Her fingers tightened around the warm mug. "What do you mean?" He nodded toward the window. She crossed to it and looked out. There in the untouched snow just beyond the fence line were tracks boot prints, not animal. Deep enough to show a man had stood there a while watching. A shiver ran down her spine, and not from the cold. "You think it's them?" Eli's voice was steady, but his eyes were hard. "Could be. Could be someone else curious enough to regret it. Doesn't matter. Point is, they know you're here now." She turned from the window, setting the mug down. "Then I can't stay. If they're watching the ridge, they'll guess what you mean to me." He didn't argue the point, just said, "If you go back down, they'll be waiting closer. Might not give you the chance to see them coming. What are you suggesting?" "That you stay here until I make sure the trail's clear. And if it's not..." He let the words hang, unfinished. She hated that part of her wanted to agree, that the cabin's thick. Walls and the loaded shotgun by the door made her feel safer than the bustle of town ever had. "And the laundry? My room? I'll ride down, speak to the woman runs it, say you're taking in mending up here for the winter. Folks will believe it. You work enough to make it true." She wanted to ask what he'd say if her kin showed their faces in town, but instead she sat at the table, wrapping her hands around the coffee. "You're too calm about all this." "I've had trouble come to my door before," he said. "Difference is, I know this ground better than they do, and I'm not about to let you be driven out." They spent the morning in a quiet rhythm, hauling in more wood from the shed, her stitching patches onto the worn knees of his trousers. Every sound outside seemed sharper in the cold, the crack of branches echoing like rifle fire, the creak of the fence posts carrying through the still air. Around midday, Eli saddled the mule. "I'll be back before dark. Keep the door barred until I am." She stood at the threshold watching him ride down the trail, the sound of the mule's hooves fading into the hush of snow. Once he disappeared, the cabin seemed larger, emptier. She moved from window to window, scanning the trees, every shadow a possible figure. By late afternoon, the sun dipped low and the temperature dropped fast. She'd just stoked the stove when the sound of boots crunching snow reached her ears. Her pulse jumped. The door latch was firm under her palm as she peered out through the narrow crack in the curtain. A man stood just beyond the fence. Not Eli. Tall, with a scarf pulled high over his mouth, hat brim low. His coat was fine wool, not the rough canvas worn by men in Silver Vein. Her stomach turned cold Whitcomb colours, muted but still there. He didn't call out, just stood, eyes fixed on the cabin. Then, slowly, he lifted something from his coat pocket and tossed it into the snow inside the fence. Without a word, he turned and walked back into the trees, his boots leaving a trail that vanished in the shadows. Clara waited until he was gone, until even the wind stopped carrying the sound of him, before she stepped outside. The cold bit at her skin, the snow groaning under her weight. She bent and picked up what he'd left, a folded scrap of paper, edges damp from the snow. Inside, she laid it flat on the table, smoothing it open. In neat, sharp handwriting it read, "Come home before spring, or we come for you." The paper trembled in her hands, though she wasn't sure if it was from fear or anger. She fed it into the stove, watching the edges curl black and the words vanish in flame. By the time Eli returned, night had fallen, and the sky was bright with stars over the ridge. He stomped snow from his boots and glanced at her face before even removing his coat. What happened? She told him every detail except how her hands had shaken when she burned the note. When she finished, his jaw was tight, his voice low. "They won't give another warning. What do we do? We make it so if they come, they regret it." It wasn't bluster. There was a quiet certainty to his tone, the same certainty in his hands when he began checking the shotgun and laying a second by the door. He moved like a man setting up for a storm he'd weathered before, not rushing but not wasting a second. That night she lay under the quilts listening to him move about the cabin, the scrape of wood, the click of metal, the steady sound of boots on the plank floor. Each noise told her the same thing. He was making himself into a wall between her and the world outside, and for the first time since running from her kin, she thought, just barely, that she might not have to face them alone. The night after the warning note, the ridge was quiet in a way that made the hair rise on Clara's arms. The snow reflected moonlight so brightly it was almost day, shadows sharp against the drifts. Eli stayed awake by the stove, his chair tipped back just enough to see both the door and the single window. The shotgun leaned against his knee. Clara lay on the bunk, eyes open, listening to the pop of the fire and the faint whistle of wind around the chimney. She didn't realize she'd drifted until a sound snapped her awake, a muffled crunch, too heavy for falling snow. Eli was already moving, the chair legs hitting the floor, his hand closing around the shotgun. He didn't speak, only glanced at her, a single look that told her to stay where she was. The noise came again, closer this time, boots in snow. Then a low creak from the porch boards. Clara's pulse hammered in her throat. Eli's shoulders tensed, and in one smooth motion he unlatched the door and flung it open. Two men stood there in the moonlight, both in heavy coats, scarves up to their eyes. One had the fine wool and polished boots of her kin's household guards. The other was broader, rougher, with a scar running from his ear to his jaw. Neither expected the door to open so suddenly. The scarred one stepped forward, voice muffled. "We're here for the lady. She's coming home." Eli stepped fully into the doorway, his size filling it edge to edge. "No," he said. "Just that." "She belongs to her people," the other man said, voice clipped, impatient. Eli's tone didn't rise. "She belongs where she chooses. She chose here." The scarred one shifted his weight, hand brushing the butt of the pistol at his side. "Don't make this hard." Eli took one step forward onto the porch, and something in the way he moved made both men pause. "You don't want hard," he said. "Hard as me burying you in that snow before the sun comes up." The wind stirred, lifting the edges of their coats. Clara could feel the tension knotting the air between them, like the moment before a rope snaps. Her hands tightened in the quilt, but she forced herself to stand to move beside Eli. "I'm not going back," she said, her voice sharper than she expected. "You tell my kin they can burn their threats in their own stove. I'm staying." The two men looked at her, then at Eli, then at each other. Whatever they saw in his face, or maybe in hers, made them decide. Without a word, they stepped back from the porch, their boots crunching in retreat. The scarred one gave Eli a long look over his shoulder before disappearing into the trees. Eli closed the door, dropped the latch, and turned to her. "That won't be the last of them." "I know." He studied her for a long moment. You could still leave. Take the stage east. Vanish where they can't follow. She shook her head. I've been vanishing for too long. I'm done running. His mouth didn't curve into a smile, but something eased in his eyes. Then we make this place ready. The rest of the night passed in slow, steady work. They hauled more wood inside, checked the shutters, laid out extra quilts, loaded both shotguns. By dawn, the cabin looked the same from the outside, but inside it felt like something else, a fort, a promise. When the first light spilled over the ridge, Eli stood at the window looking out at the untouched snow. They'll come again, he said. Might be weeks, might be days, but when they do? He turned to her, voice firm. I meant what I said before. I'll build you a cabin and fill it with children, but first we hold it. Clara stepped up beside him, her shoulder brushing his arm. The fear was still there, yes, but so was something steadier, something rooted. She glanced at the small wooden cradle on the shelf, the quilts inside, the walls they had built together. For the first time since she'd fled, she didn't feel like a guest in her own life. The snow outside glittered under the new sun, hiding whatever tracks might lead danger to their door. She knew it would come. She also knew they would meet it together, and if you've read this far, then maybe you understand. Sometimes the fight for a home is the start of a life worth living. Maybe you'd have stayed on that ridge too, would you? Or would you have run?